the UAR option to keep property on market, time clause addendum. Now, this form has been in existence since 1998. Now, certainly there have been a number of iterations and modifications since then, with the latest coming in July of 2020. Now, let me go through some of the main points of this form. So the premise behind this form is that the buyer and seller, they go under contract, but if they agree to this addendum, it allows the seller to continue to market the property and potentially accept another offer that triggers certain aspects of this form. So let's look through this form. So in section 1, it allows the buyer the opportunity to continue to market the property and to accept any backup offer. And at the seller's sole discretion, they may notify the buyer in writing. Now that gives the seller the option as to whether or not they want to potentially kick out buyer number 1 and replace buyer number 1 with buyer number 2. But if they don't, then they don't have to trigger this. So it gives the seller the option. In 1B, it allows the buyer the right to remove certain conditions of purchase from the buyer's purchase contract. And if you notice in section 1B, it allows the buyer a certain number of days. Previous versions of this form had hours, and very often this form was referred to as the 72-hour time clause. That was just something that people would use. Now it says days, so certainly be aware of that the days that a buyer has to remove conditions is up to the buyer and seller when it comes to negotiating this. Then under section 1B, it goes through the number of conditions when it comes to the rights to purchase for a buyer. Due diligence, appraisal, and then also financing, and if applicable, the subject to sale of buyer's property condition. Most often this form is used to try to remove the financing and the subject to sale condition, but it doesn't have to be. It could be used for the other conditions as well. In addition to this, when a buyer does remove those conditions, section 1C addresses additional earnest money. Now, if buyer and seller put 0, then no additional earnest money is necessary. But it does allow the seller to ask for something more for the buyer to have the right to remove these conditions. And I would emphasize that if I'm representing a seller, earnest money realistically is the amount that a seller can go after when it comes to a buyer default or a failure to perform. So for a seller's perspective, getting as much earnest money as possible is ideal in most situations. Now, under section 1D, if the buyer, for whatever reason, doesn't feel comfortable putting additional earnest money or doesn't feel comfortable removing those conditions, they don't have to. Now, what happens if they don't remove those conditions? Then the REPC will automatically cancel and the buyer will get their original earnest money back. Now, if that section 1D works in conjunction with section 1B, which again is that window of time that a buyer has the right to remove conditions. So if it's 3 days and the buyer goes past 3 days and doesn't remove conditions, then the purchase contract between the buyer and seller automatically cancels.